So here I am with a death certificate, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit on it here. Sorry, I don't have enough followers to go live with my mobile phone. So I've got this death certificate, and I've got all of my noticings still on here. So I've transcribed some of these over onto an index card. So I'm going to move those off so that I can do a little bit closer reading here. And one of the big questions that we have about approaching these types of authentic real-world text is, how do you navigate it? And if I were an actual coroner or somebody like that, and I were navigating this as a writer, of course it's structured from 1 to 20. So I just take my 1 to 20 and try to make sure I fill everything in. But I'm willing to bet, if you're the coroner, that there's some of these items that you kind of have to gather as you go. You have to talk to people to get some of these answers, and other people to get other answers. So, and also some of these answers are family dependent. Some of them would come from other documents, like a driver's license or wallet, from the house itself, all of those kinds of things. So if you're actually writing a death certificate, it's that 1 through 20 sort of gives you that approach to, I'm going to get all of this information and I can treat it sequentially, or I just watch each of the boxes as I get the information. I'm making sure that I can fill it in. If I'm going to read a death certificate, it's interesting to me, because what I find when I bring pieces like this into kids, they're like I am. You don't just start at box 1 and say, this was a person who died in St. Louis at this address. The person's name was Charles G. Aufrichtig. The person was male. The person was white. The person was married. Born on November 1st, 1884. I don't see that as the way that people approach this. People who are going to read a death certificate are going to kind of browse for significant information. So one of the first things that I've noticed, that if you have a stack of death certificates, that kids often gravitate towards this box over here, which is box 17, which is the cause of death, the date of death, and so on. And the title up above that, right above items 16, 17, and 18, actually says medical certificate of death. So this is actually something that has to be signed by a doctor, and this doctor is the deputy coroner. So what I find is that kids want to get right to this: cyanide potassium poison, contributory source of death, suicide. So this is a tragic death certificate, and every death has some kind of a tragedy or loss to it, but this is a violent death. So we start kind of reading around that to figure out, okay, this is a person who met a very difficult and bad end. What more can we find out about this person to sort of put together the holistic story? How much of that story is on the death certificate? And starting in the mid-1800s, it became very common for them to put this kind of information over here, which is the occupation. And the occupation on this death certificate says president, copper steel manufacturer, MFR there. So now I've got 2 bits of a story: a person who died of cyanide potassium poisoning, who was the president of a copper and steel manufacturing company in St. Louis. So this person was born in St. Louis. The name of the father was Alois Aufrichtig. And this person, his father was from Hungary, mother Jenny Lederer from Bohemia, which we could look that up. It would all be kind of fun stuff to be digging into, just to do the detective work on who this person was. But we're talking about someplace like Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. So we've got 2 people from Eastern Europe here, and a son that was born in St. Louis. So this is an immigrant story. Then we've got this bit up here. This person was born in 1884. And then what date are we talking about now? 1918. So we do the math on that. We've got somebody who's not quite 34 years old. To get a sense for how old or not old that is, when I'm talking to grade school kids, elementary school kids, we often talk about how old their parents are. So this is a pretty common age for kids in grade school to have parents in their mid-30s. So this gives a frame of reference. This story is starting to come together in really interesting ways for me. So 33 years old, 9 months and 11 days. And then I come over here and I look at the date of death, and it reads August something 1918. The other interesting part of this death certificate to me is that I've had long and deep arguments with kids about what that second number is. It's hard to read. We have arguments about whether it's a 4, a 2, a 7, what does it look like? And so we start looking at this person's handwriting all over the rest of the document so that we can find out what the other numbers look like. And we see here, here, and here that anytime this person writes a 1, it looks like that. So it's not a 1. We don't see a lot of 2s. So there they are. There's 228 Lombard in his address. Does that look the same as those kinds of 2s? And sometimes with cursive, maybe that is the way it looks. A 4, there's a 4, and the 4 really clearly has a cross in this one, up and down. And here it looks like the path has gone down and then up. So what is that number? Is it? It's maybe more likely that it's a 2, probably not a 7, because we see that this person does their 7s with these little loops here. So that starts to bother me, because what I'm seeing here is that the person was buried on August 14th, 1918. Right there is another piece of the story. So I'm starting to see that if I start moving around this document, the question of who this person is, how they lived, how and when they died starts to become kind of a mystery piece for us here. So the date of death, it would make most sense that the date of death would be August 12th, and then the date of burial would be August 14th. But what my students get to with me here is that if this is August 14th and the date of death is put in like something like that you can't read, there's a big question about, was this document, is it accurate? Was everything written in at the exact same time, or was this death date somehow fiddled with? So that begins to be kind of a mystery, and people start to think, oh, what kinds of conspiracies could we have going on, and why would we have conspiracies? So as far as stories go, we're not just talking about anybody, we're talking about the president of a copper and steel manufacturing company in 1918. So there starts to be a whole background knowledge thing that's going on here. And what I found was fascinating about reading this is that there's actually a lot of information about this guy on the internet because of who he was, because of what copper and steel manufacturing is in St. Louis, what that was like in 1918, just after World War I. So actually looking up some of the background knowledge that goes along with this becomes a key part of reading the text. So I look at these things. It says occupation, trade, profession, or particular kind of work. B, general nature of the industry, business, or establishment in which employed or employer. This is very different from the old kinds of death registers. If I go back to an old death register from 1842, I find that list of occupations is just occupations. It just says mason, it just says laborer, it just says merchant or something like that. So they realized that by the early 1900s that they wanted to know a little bit more. He was a president, and that wasn't going to be enough information, so they had to put the concern, the company that he worked for, beyond some of the information that they had in this old kind of register, just the age, the gender, the trade, and the cause of death. We had the desire to know a little bit about their family history. Who were their parents? Where were their parents from? Just a better way to identify people. Right here it says, if death occurred in a hospital or institution, give its name instead of a street and number. It actually says a street and number in the 7th Ward, which means that this person died at an address. And What I was also able to do is I was able to use then Google Maps to get in and actually look up this address in St. Louis. And one of the fascinating things to do with that is that we don't know if this address is a home or whether he died at work. And if he died at work, does this story become more interesting and difficult for us? So if this cyanide poisoning happened at his office as opposed to happening at his house. So all interesting stuff. It does not give the name or any of the information about his descendants or his current family. So it says that he's married, but we don't have the name of the wife. We don't have the name of the children, none of that kind of thing. So let's just read through some of the other items that are here. So length of residence and at place of death, lived there. And it says for how many years, months, days in the state, years, months, and days. And where was the disease contracted, if not at the place of death? Former or usual residence, 3668 Lafayette. So we have a second address there and a little bit more information about that question that we have about what's happening here. So the death was actually registered here, but they're saying that the actual poisoning happened at this place and then that he was taken home. We've got the place of burial or death, Mount Sinai Cemetery. Would we be able to find a picture of this grave on findagrave.com? Date of burial, the undertaker, A. Rinsdorf, the address of the cemetery, 4419 Olives. So we might want to look that up as well. So this is not only giving us a story, it's giving us a set of background questions that we could use to do a further inquiry on this. So really easy to dig in deep on a death certificate, but also it's not like reading a novel. It's not like sitting down and reading chapters of a book through and through. It's very much in what we discovered in the noticings is that each of these boxes of text is a question that has an answer with it. We do have to, with a death certificate like this, be able to decode cursive print. And also to be able to read some of the small print, the switching back and forth between capitals and lower cases, finding these small labels and so on. So this is not a kindergarten first grade text, but if I were thinking about kindergarten first grade text, I might read a lot of authentic text this same way, where I'm browsing around for what are the key pieces of information and what kind of format it's in and what it helps me understand how I read the words. Now, fluency is a completely different thing with this kind of text, isn't it? You don't expect people to read word, 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 word. You expect them to go to a place, spend a little bit of time puzzling over some of the decoding, getting it as right as they can, and then talking about it so that they're actually making a comprehension moment out of each one of these little boxes, and then assembling comprehension from them by reasoning. This before this before this, and so on. So can be pretty tricky to teach if the kids aren't ready for something like this. One of the ways we can get kids ready for things like that is to bring in the right kinds of death certificates and to get them actually bringing in some of their own. So this is the death certificate for my great-grandmother, Isabella Markham Benbow Erickson, and she died back in the early 1900s, 1914, and I named my first daughter after her. She was a pretty interesting fixture in the family. Also, a child of immigrants from England. This is one way to get people into it. Another way to get people into it is to have those death certificates of famous people. So I have death certificates from people like John Lennon from the Beatles. I have a death certificate from Frank Sinatra, one from Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols. You can look up Marilyn Monroe's death certificate and so on. So there are different ways to get people into this as a type of text. And then I've just made a social studies inquiry out of actually just looking for interesting deaths that you can find in vital records. All of these vital records are online for all of the states. When I started collecting this back in the early 2000s, Missouri was one of the first states that actually had their stuff all digitized and online. And so that's why I ended up going there when we were working on a social studies inquiry on the influenza epidemic. So coming back to this mentor text study, it depends on you actually doing all of that gathering and getting the classroom library enriched. If you're going to have a specific kind of text like brochures or menus, you need to have some tubs and binders filled with that type of thing so that the kids can go to it. Again, get yourself the office supplies that you need, acetate sheets, card stock, whatever it's going to take to keep things readable and usable over time. Expect these types of texts to be expendable, because if they're current and they're ephemeral, they're going to get ruined and you're going to need to bring in more. So you'll always want to get your kids working with you on actually doing the gathering phase. But once you get down to the reading side of things, starting out the year with some I do, we do, you do approach to things makes it far easier by October and November to really just do what Katie Wood-Ray talks about in her chapter on the close readings. She's talking about March. By the time you get to March, there's just so much you do happening that the teacher can barely keep control of any type of instructional time, which she didn't really need because the kids knew what to do. Providing the kids with the materials that are routine for this type of noticing is important. And then for their close readings, the kinds of materials that you need to support for those as well. All right.